Well, what can we do?
I think there's a lot we can do.
Maybe we should talk about that. Yeah, where would you start?
Well, I think we have to remember that this is a minority of our country. I think most American Christians reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. Most Americans are not on board with this at all. And we have the power, we just need to use it. One of the reasons the movement is so effective is that they're very good at turning out the vote in disproportionate numbers. George Barna, who's an evangelical pollster, he sort of crunched the numbers and he said, you know, in 2016, just 10% of the country were the most sort of devoted religious right supporters, but 91% turned out to vote, and 93% of those turned out to vote for Donald Trump. When you have such a huge voter turnout, look, 50%, 40 to 50% of Americans don't bother to turn out to vote. And also, sometimes people might vote in the national elections, but they don't bother to vote in local elections or state elections. Right. But if they can, turn out people to vote in those large numbers, they can really dominate elections. Yeah. But here, what we're starting to see is they realize that even with their numbers, that they're from this disproportionate turnout, they can't win in a lot of instances because their policies are very unpopular with most of the country, and most of the country is not at all on board with this kind of legitimation of bigotry and contempt. So they're starting to foster this idea that elections that don't go their way are illegitimate. Yeah. And that's very dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a place where the church really needs to be engaged. In much of the country, for much of the history, especially in rural communities like where I grew up, you need buildings to be precinct places for elections. A lot of those buildings are church buildings. So churches have been places where the sort of basic functioning of democracy has happened, and there has to be a Republican and there has to be a Democrat, co-leading that precinct. And, it's been bipartisan, but it's been a sort of way that the church has been invested in the public life and the common good. I think part of what has happened with this movement is that people who saw it as extreme, people who saw it as radical, have been very quiet for a long time. A lot of, like you were saying, this isn't a majority position among Americans. It's not even a majority position among Christians. But you wouldn't know that from listening to most public coverage of what Christianity looks like in public life, because the loudest voices in public life have been these people who are part of this movement.
Do you think that pastors are worried about dividing their congregations and alienating people, or are they afraid of violating their 501c3 status?
Well, I think pastors have some legitimate concerns. There are legitimate concerns about the separation of church and state, about not wanting to become just a sort of politicized entity within a community. And that, I think, led some pastors who saw what the so-called religious right was doing in the 80s and 90s to say, I want no part with that. Even someone like Billy Graham, as conservative as he was, and frankly, as responsible as he was for a lot of what is now Christian nationalism in terms of building a culture around it, even someone like him was able to say in the 80s, like, that's a bad idea. I don't like the religious right, I don't want to be part of that. So there is that. But then I think you're right. There's also a level of fear because, these demographic changes that are happening also mean that churches that had a big and broad base in the mid-20th century now have old and aging buildings with also old and aging people, right? So there's less financial resources, there's less people resources, while many churches are trying to carry on with the same level of programming that they have. So there is fear that we might lose the support of someone who sees this as too political. But I think we have to be honest about the fact that we stand to lose a lot more if there's not if there's not only this sort of effort to build the basic framework that's needed for democracy, but also if there's not some sense that the church has a positive vision for the community. Because when you look at the numbers from Pew, that does the religion research regularly, over the last 4 decades, as this movement has grown in its influence and Christianity has increasingly been perceived as a kind of right-wing, politicized movement, at the same time, the number of people who grew up in Christian traditions who affirmed them as adults has gone down. So it's, you know, a chart where they basically cross each other. The increase of Christian nationalism has led pretty directly to the decrease of people who affirm the faith that they grew up in. The Pew study calls these people the nuns. And I always say that's not good news for the monastery. You know, these are not the N-U-N-S, it's the N-O-N-E-S, the people who, when asked what is your religious affiliation, they say none. So yeah, I think that while the church has good reasons to be concerned about the separation of church and state, I think we have more reasons right now to cultivate a positive public witness for the common good.
Do you think that messaging is enough? Or what do you think about initiatives like voter guides? You know, that the churches, through organizations like Watchmen on the Wall and Faith Wins, or you know, these other pastoral organizations, are distributing voter guides, which are supposedly nonpartisan, but boil elections down to, you know, who's got the biblical approach on this issue and who doesn't. And it's nobody looking at these voter guides comes away with any doubt about which way they're being told to vote.
Well, you know, being a lifelong student of the Bible, I actually think that there are biblical values that speak to public issues, and I think the church should be clear about that. The Bible's vision is pretty obviously political. You know, God calls people and calls them to be, you know, a blessing to the nations, and there's, you know, economic implications to that. There's implications for how you treat your neighbor, for how you treat immigrants, for you know, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. You know, all of these things are very concrete and political realities. I don't think that you have to be partisan to do that. But yeah, I think churches need to be a lot more engaged with the issues of public life and with inviting people to reflect deeply on how we put that into action. It's, you know, in some ways, I think the religious right and the way that it mobilized this movement for Christian nationalism was right in their claim. I'm speaking as a person of Christian faith. I think they're right in the claim that Christianity is political. They're just very wrong about their vision of what, you know, a Christian politic would look like. And so I encourage churches to, yeah, get more involved, not only in the kind of direct service that churches are often engaged in, but in the building up of a political culture that can make life work for everyone. But I wonder, you know, for someone like you who has, you know, in reporting, also tried to emphasize the constitutional commitment to the separation of church and state. You know, what do you think the sort of guardrails should be, or the kind of guiding principle should be for congregations that want to be about promoting the common good for everyone in the community, but doing that as churches and as people of faith?
It's an interesting question, and I understand why it makes people very uncomfortable to get involved. You know, we all want to respect, most of us want to respect these constitutional principles. We don't want to, you know, step out of, you know, I think a lot of religious leaders don't want to step out of their wheelhouse and start engaging. It would be a nicer world if we could look at issues of policy and politics without having to, you know, without having to, you know, violate in a way that private spiritual realm, you know. But I think we're really in kind of an all hands on deck moment for our democracy. I have a friend who's 88 years old, and she's absolutely wonderful. She nearly lost her life during her second pregnancy because she had a really terrible health condition. And as a consequence, she got involved in the move to liberalize abortion laws. And she said, we would have been nowhere without the clergy. I think she said it was United Methodists who kind of, where she, in her region, they sort of stood up and stood alongside those activists who were trying to kind of create more sort of ethical, reproductive laws. And that was kind of astonishing for me to hear.
Yeah, clergy for reproductive justice. It was a fairly normal thing during that movement. And I think we need a church that is committed to justice and to, fleshing that out. And I think part of the reason that we haven't had that in as bold a way as Americans remember that from, say, the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, when many churches were challenged to do that, is I think that people were afraid to engage this kind of, radicalized and increasingly radicalized talk from Christian nationalists because it seemed like a messy fight to get involved in. And meanwhile, I think we've ceded a lot to them. So I want to say thank you, really, on behalf of the church that I love, to you and folks like you who decided to pay attention and to say, like, what's happening here is really dangerous. And we can't just ignore it and hope that it'll go away. Because I think that was kind of the attitude that a lot of us in the church had for a long time. And now it's very much before us, and it's really critical for us to understand it if we're going to offer an alternative to it. So we owe a great debt to people like you who paid attention. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for your work and your inspiration. It's just such a pleasure to engage with you always.